Welcome to the Herbal Hour. I'm your host, Stephen Horne, and the topic of today's presentation is diabetes, a modern epidemic. And that's really what diabetes is in modern society. Diabetes has long been the third leading cause of death in the United States and actually in most civilized nations. The number one cause, of course, is heart disease, and the number two cause is cancer. But diabetes is on the increase. In the last 20 years, the percentage of the population with diabetes has doubled, and it's gone right along with the increase in the problem of obesity, and they're very interrelated. So we're going to look in this presentation at what diabetes is, what's causing this increase in diabetes, and what we can do about it, and how we can help people who have diabetes to overcome this problem with natural remedies. Now, the first thing we need to understand is that there are two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. And these two types of diabetes are actually very, very different health problems. Type 1 has sometimes been called juvenile diabetes or insulin-dependent diabetes, and type 2, adult onset or non-insulin dependent diabetes. The difference between these two types is the amount of insulin they produce. A healthy person produces about 31 units of insulin per day on the average. Now, it varies with what they're eating, of course, and so forth. But the type 1 diabetic, which is only about 10 to 15% of the cases, produces only 4 units of insulin on the average. So what we have in the type 1 diabetic is a destruction of the pancreatic cells that produce insulin, so that there is a lack of insulin being produced in the body. And this is probably an autoimmune disorder. In other words, something triggers the immune system to destroy the cells of the pancreatic tail where insulin is produced, and therefore you wind up not being able to produce insulin. This is a very, very difficult type of diabetes to deal with, and does not respond very well to natural remedies. It does really require insulin supplementation, insulin shots. Now, the type 2 diabetic, which is actually the more prevalent kind, 85 to 90% of the cases, produces too much insulin. They produce an average of 114 units of insulin a day. And the reason why they're diabetic is because the cells of their body have become resistant to insulin. And this is typically due to the overconsumption of refined and simple carbohydrates, and to improper dietary fats and a lack of exercise or certain nutrients that help the cells take up insulin. So type 2 diabetes is what we're mainly going to be focusing on in this video, because type 2 diabetes is not only the more prevalent kind, but it's the kind that we can really do something about with natural remedies. Looking again at type 1 diabetes, I want to talk just a little bit about what you can do for this. Type 1 diabetics are going to require insulin. I have not found any dependable supplementation program that will rebuild the pancreatic tail and get it to start producing insulin again. I've had some people who've told me that by very aggressively doing some of the things that you can do for type 2 diabetes, that they have been able to turn around early stages of type 1 diabetes. Like a child who's just starting to go diabetic, they've been able to reverse it. But once it's in place, I don't know any dependable therapy that's going to get the person not to need insulin. However, the amount of insulin that's required to control this kind of diabetes can be reduced by using some of the same remedies that we use for type 2 diabetes, which is good news, because by reducing the amount of insulin required, we can reduce some of the side effects of that insulin and help these people to have better lives. So that's the main thing we can do for type 1 diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes, contrary to all of the popular medical opinion, is actually a lifestyle disease, which means that it is created out of people's lifestyle. Therefore, it can be controlled through lifestyle changes and supplements, and therefore it can be actually cured. And a lot of people say you can't cure this, but I know quite a few people who've cured themselves of type 2 diabetes. The earlier you get to it, in other words, when you first realize you have type 2 diabetes, it's easier to reverse than after you've been on medication for a long time. But it is a very manageable disease, if a person is willing to pay the price and do the things that are necessary to change this. Now, there may be some cases where they won't totally be able to get off medication, but lifestyle can always be improved through some of the things we're going to talk about in this particular video. Now, before we move on to what can be done, let's talk a little bit about some of the health problems that are associated with diabetes. First of all, diabetes greatly increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, which is heart attacks and strokes and so forth, which is the #1 cause of death in this country. So this is one of the reasons why diabetes is something we need to really be concerned about, because we're trying to lower a person's chances of dying of heart disease. One of the problems with diabetes is it causes a loss of peripheral circulation. That's circulation to the extremities of the body. And because of that, people will often get things like ulcerations in their skin on their legs, or problems with their feet. Some people wind up getting gangrene or other diseases because they don't get good blood flow out to the extremities of the body. That loss of blood flow is also a leading cause of blindness, because what happens is the capillaries in the eyes get congested. You don't get good blood circulation to the eyes, and so diabetes is the leading cause of blindness in this country. And of course, the fourth thing is diabetes is typically associated with weight gain, and obesity increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases and also causes problems with a person's general health, and also sometimes their self-esteem and their feelings about themselves. Now, before we, in order to understand diabetes, we need to understand a little bit about sugar, because diabetes is all about how the body processes carbohydrates. And all carbohydrates are broken down into the body in the digestive tract into simple sugars so they can be used by the cells. Sugar is the primary fuel for muscle movement. It's also the primary fuel for brain activity. And the brain uses more sugar than any other organ. About 25% of the sugar in the blood is used by the brain. So even though it's a very small organ up here, it's consuming a great percentage of the sugar in order to keep the nervous system operating properly. The muscles are the second biggest user of sugar, and they, of course, use that for physical activity. Now, the sugar that's in our blood is called glucose, and there's a number of different kinds of sugar, but when we talk about blood sugar, we're talking about a sugar called glucose. And the carbohydrates that we eat, whether they're starches or other forms of sugar like fructose, get converted into glucose to create blood sugar so that our body can run these things. Now, to regulate the amount of sugar in our blood, we have two different hormones that are secreted by the pancreas. One is called insulin, and the other one is glucagon. And these two hormones have their sole purpose is to keep the amount of sugar in the blood stable for the sake of the brain. The brain is the only organ of the body that takes up sugar without the mediating influence of insulin. So the amount of sugar that gets into your brain is directly controlled by the amount of sugar that's in the blood. If there's too much sugar in the blood, then you're going to have an excess of sugar running into the brain, and the brain is going to be kind of hyperstimulated. If you have too little sugar in the blood, then the brain is not going to be taking up enough sugar, and it's going to be a little bit depressed in its function, and it's not going to work as well. So insulin and glucagon are designed to keep the level of sugar in the blood stable for the sake of the brain and nervous system. So insulin removes excess sugar from the blood and stores it so it will lower blood sugar levels. Whereas glucagon brings the sugar out of storage in the liver to raise the blood sugar levels so that they stay stable again. We can look at this a little further with understanding how this works. Insulin helps the cells absorb sugar, so it's a storage hormone. The two primary places that the sugar gets stored are, first of all, in the form of glycogen in the liver and muscles. So glycogen is called animal starch. It's basically a starch-like compound that the body produces to store sugar. And the storage in the muscles is so that when we have a burst of physical activity, like we've got to run or do something, there's a storage of sugar that in the muscles that's readily there to be broken down and utilized for that extra burst of energy we need. The storage of sugar in the liver is designed to maintain sugar stores for the sake of the brain. So the sugar in the liver, the glycogen stores in the liver, are the ones that help keep the blood sugar stable for the brain. The liver should be able to store enough glycogen to keep the blood sugar level stable for about 24 to 48 hours so that your brain will have sugar to do that. After that time, the body turns to other mechanisms of breaking down fats or proteins or whatever to get sugar for the brain. So this insulin is stimulated by eating simple carbohydrates. Anytime we eat things that are starchy or have a lot of sugars, insulin is released so that that sugar can be shunted into storage. The second place that sugar gets stored, and I kind of got ahead of myself here, is it gets stored in fat. So once the glycogen stores are full, then any extra sugar gets shunted into the body to be stored as fat. So you can see that eating a lot of carbohydrates and triggering a lot of insulin production is going to cause the body to gain weight, to put on fat reserves. The other thing about insulin is it depresses glucagon production. These two hormones are on what's called a hormonal axis. That means that as one goes up, the other one goes down. So it's like a teeter-totter. Okay? So when insulin levels rise, they tend to depress glucagon production. As glucagon levels rise, they tend to suppress insulin production. So it's like a teeter-totter to keep the blood sugar stable. Okay, moving back to the glucagon. Glucagon removes the storage, releases the storage of sugar in the liver, again to bring the sugar level up for the brain. So it's a metabolizing or mediating hormone. It helps to mobilize sugar and get it moving again. And its release is stimulated by protein, and it depresses insulin production. So when a person has hypoglycemia, that is their blood sugar level is low, it's typically because they're producing too much insulin, glucagon production is depressed, and so the body's having a hard time mobilizing sugar out of the liver in order to bring the blood sugar level back up. And one of the standard therapies for hypoglycemia for years and years has been to eat small amounts of high protein foods frequently throughout the day, which is going to stimulate the glucagon and get that sugar mobilized from the liver so that the body is going to release that sugar and put it back into the blood to keep the blood sugar level stable. Now I'm going to show you some charts from a book called The Anti-Aging Zone by Barry Sears. And this is a book I highly recommend because it will really help you to understand how diet influences a lot of our hormones. And the first chart I want to show you is a chart that shows the relative risk of dying of heart disease on several different risk factors. And the first one, the one with the yellow bar, is insulin. And you notice that you have a really high risk of dying from heart disease with excess insulin production. The second one is triglycerides, that's high triglycerides. The third one is high LDL cholesterol, that's the bad kind of cholesterol. And the fourth one is high HDL cholesterol, which is the good kind of cholesterol. So what we're showing here is that insulin and triglyceride levels are actually a much better indicator of your risk for heart disease than high cholesterol levels. In fact, you have about twice the risk of dying of heart disease with high insulin levels than you do with high cholesterol levels. So the focus on cholesterol is really kind of misplaced. We need to reduce the insulin production to reduce our risk of heart disease. The second chart here shows that it's the ratio of triglycerides to high density cholesterol, high density lipoproteins, that's really important. Not the overall amount, but the ratio is more critical. So if you have very high triglycerides and very low HDL cholesterol, then you're going to have a very high triglyceride HDL cholesterol level. And you can see that at a level of a ratio of 1.4, your risk of heart disease is very low, but by the time you get a 7.5 ratio, you've got about 16 times the risk of dying of heart disease as you do with the lower one. And insulin plays a very, very important role in creating that high triglyceride to HDL cholesterol level. So that's why diabetes is so linked to heart disease. So here are some of the problems that are associated with excess insulin in the body. Weight gain, we've already explained why that's the case. Increased risk of cardiovascular disease, as we've just shown from the charts various years. There's also, as we'll discuss a little later on, an increased production of what we might call bad eicosanoids. Eicosanoids are these little hormonal messengers that our cells produce to communicate with neighboring cells. And there are eicosanoids that tend to constrict our arteries, raise our blood pressure, that tend to increase inflammatory responses in our body and so forth. And excess insulin promotes those eicosanoids and depresses the kind that reduce inflammation and so forth. So excess insulin is also associated with high blood pressure, inflammatory diseases, autoimmune disorders, and even cancer. So these bad eicosanoids that are produced, or these eicosanoids that when they're produced too much cause bad reactions, is what we're really talking about, are greatly influenced by excess insulin. Also, the inhibition of glucagon causes hypoglycemia, so excess insulin causes hypoglycemia, and it causes an increase in the resistance of cells, which eventually leads to type 2 diabetes. So those are all problems that we have with too much insulin production. Now, excess insulin has been given a kind of a new disease name. It's called hyperinsulinemia. To break that down into English, hyper means excess. Insulin, of course, refers to the hormone insulin. And emia means in the blood. So hyperinsulinemia just means excess insulin in the blood, a fancy term for that. Some people have dubbed this Syndrome X. And this Syndrome X is really linked with a whole bunch of health problems that are very common in our culture. We'll look at a few of those right now. Hypertension, hardening of the arteries, rapid aging, hypothyroidism, that means a lack of thyroid function, hypoglycemia, which causes a poor tolerance to stress, depressed immunity and adrenal fatigue, anxiety, and also depression, and cysts in the ovaries. So these are all very common problems that we have in our modern society, and they're all due to hyperinsulinemia. So how do you tell if you're producing too much insulin, which of course again is going to increase your risk of having this type 2 diabetes? Well, the first thing you look at is your waist to hip ratio. That means you take a measurement of your waist right at your navel, and then you take a measurement of your hips at the widest portion of the hips, and you put the waist measurement over the hip measurement. So if for males, if your waist measurement is bigger than your hip measurement, meaning like say you have a 34-inch hip and a 34-inch waist, you're okay. But if you have a 36-inch waist and a 34-inch hip, then you have a waist-hip ratio that's greater than 1:1. And that means that you're probably having problems with hyperinsulinemia, because one of the things insulin does is it puts on abdominal fat. With women, it's a little different. A women's hip measurement and their waist measurement should be in a ratio of 0.8 to 1, meaning that the waist measurement should be no bigger than 80% of the hip measurement. So again, if you're getting over that ratio, then you're probably hyperinsulinemic. The other way to look at that is with this triglyceride HDL cholesterol levels. If your triglycerides are higher than 200 and your HDL cholesterol is less than 35, which would put that ratio at about six times. You remember what we saw the little chart with the 7.5 being great risk of heart cardiovascular disease? Well, 200 over 35 is about 6. That means that you're definitely hyperinsulinemic and you need to work on controlling your insulin levels. So those are two ways to take a look at assessing your risk of developing diabetes. So if, say you've already developed diabetes, or you're concerned about you're hyperinsulinemic and you don't want to develop diabetes, here are some of the things that you can do to overcome this. And all of the things we're going to talk about here work both for the hyperinsulinemia, or the syndrome X, and for diabetes. And since a large percentage of the people in the population are either hyperinsulinemic or diabetic, these are very important changes for almost everyone in our culture. The first and most important thing that one has to do to overcome this is to change one's diet. So dietary changes are paramount. You will never control this with just supplements. You have to change the way that you eat. I can't stress that enough, and we're going to spend a lot of time explaining how we do that. The second part is exercise. We're a very sedentary culture. I'm going to confess that's been the one thing I've struggled with the most. I'm getting better at it. I'm learning to get out and get more physical activity. And I've always had a good diet, so fortunately that's helped me. But I'm getting to really understand the importance of exercise as part of that regime. There are also supplements that we can use for this. And some of these supplements include essential fatty acids, protein, fiber, liver herbs that help to cleanse the liver and decongest it, and then specific herbs and nutrients for overcoming insulin resistance, which we're going to go through an extensive list of in this presentation. So to understand how to deal with diet, which is the first thing we're going to do, we need to learn to zone the diet. And this is a concept that comes from Barry Sears with his Zone Diet books, which I mentioned earlier. And our number one problem here, and it's a problem I've been aware of for a long time, is our consumption of refined carbohydrates. So I'm going to sing the refined sugar blues and talk a little bit about the problems that we have with the refined sugar in our society. One is it lacks other nutrients like chromium and B vitamins and so forth, which are necessary to process sugar in our body. So when we eat simple sugars or simple starches also, like white flour and white rice, we aren't getting the other nutrients we need to process those carbohydrates. So we're depleting our stores of nutrients like chromium and B complex vitamins. The second problem with the refined sugar and refined carbohydrates is they cause a rapid rise in blood sugar levels, which creates hyperinsulinemia because it invokes a powerful insulin response. So I'm really big on, cutting down on the amount of refined sugar in our diet and replacing that with more complex carbohydrates. And as we're going to learn in a minute, it isn't just about avoiding sugar with diabetes, it's about avoiding foods that trigger insulin production. And there's some research that's been done that's created a system called the Glycemic Index. And the Glycemic Index was created by having people eat foods and then checking how much insulin that food caused them to release. So it measures the ease at which a food is converted into blood sugar, i.e. glucose, and therefore how rapidly that creates an insulin response in the body. So the more readily a food is converted to glucose in the digestive tract, the more rapid it will create a rise in blood sugar, and the more insulin that will be released in response to that rise. So foods that are rapidly digested, absorbed, and turned into glucose have a high glycemic index, where foods that are digested and absorbed more slowly and converted more gradually into glucose have a lower glycemic index. Now, originally, when they did the glycemic index, they assigned white bread a glycemic index of 100. And then what they did is they rated foods higher and lower than white bread by depending on how much insulin they released compared to white bread. Well, there's a newer glycemic index out, which they decided to make with glucose. So foods that have a high glycemic index trigger a rapid rise in blood sugar levels and a corresponding insulin production. That leads to diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. And foods with a low glycemic index don't trigger a rapid increase in insulin. So let's look at some of the examples of some of the glycemic index we have in foods. This is based on the new glycemic index, which puts eating straight glucose, in other words, eating blood sugar, and which triggers very rapid rise in your blood sugar levels, of course, as 100, and then they've rescaled this so that All of these other foods are ranked higher or lower. To convert these into the old scale, all you have to do is multiply these values by 1.4, and that gets you the index that was based with white bread being 100. But you can see here that white bread has a glycemic index of about 70. And look, wheat bread, I always thought, okay, eating wheat bread is a great thing, but wheat bread actually tests out as having a glycemic index very close to white bread. In other words, it still triggers a lot of insulin. And potatoes, which are a form of complex carbohydrate, have a higher glycemic index than white bread. So they actually trigger more insulin production than white bread. And bread and potatoes trigger more insulin production than table sugar. And honey isn't too far behind that. Same thing with popcorn. Whereas you look on the other side, I've got some foods that have a lower glycemic index. See, pearl barley, in contrast to popcorn or wheat bread, has a pretty low glycemic index of only 25, whereas brown rice is a little bit higher. Apples, see, don't have that high of a glycemic index. Grapefruit, peanuts have a very low glycemic index. Whole milk, and fructose, which is fruit sugar, has a fairly low glycemic index as well. So even though it's a refined sugar, it doesn't trigger as much insulin production. So just to give you a little idea, we produced some charts at the Tree of Life Institute, or Tree of Life Publishing, that have list high and low glycemic carbohydrates. We just arbitrarily divided it at a certain point and made, on our little chart, we show the high glycemic carbohydrates as brown and the low glycemic carbohydrates as green. And most low glycemic carbohydrates are alkaline forming, and most high glycemic carbohydrates are acid forming. So just to give you some examples, here's some examples of some high glycemic fruits. Things like bananas, dates, grapes, mango, oranges, pineapple, raisins, raspberries, strawberries, watermelon. You can see these are all very sugary foods. So they're going to have a more rapid rise in blood sugar levels. Whereas if we look at another list, these are all fruits that have a lower glycemic index. Apple, apricot, cherry, grapefruit, lemons, limes, peaches, pears, plums, and prickly pear, fruit of the cactus. Those are all lower glycemic index foods. There are only a couple of very high glycemic vegetables, and those are potatoes and yams. Whereas almost all your other vegetables are low glycemic carbohydrates. So that's good news. Of course, we always knew we were supposed to eat more vegetables, so that should come as no surprise. Grains tend to be very high glycemic carbohydrates. The only exceptions to these, there are only 3 grains that have a lower glycemic index, and they are barley, corn, and rye. So eating a lot of grain is going to contribute a lot to diabetes. In fact, I listened to a lecture by Paul Bergner, and he was saying that diabetes was unheard of until people started cultivating grain. And so the first instance of diabetes are recorded in Ayurvedic medicine when people started cultivating rice. And so the grain is a big problem. The overconsumption of grain is a big problem, creating this problem with the glycemic index. So what we need to do is we need to change a little bit about the way we eat if we want to avoid this. And so zoning the plate means that what we want is you want to have about 2/3 of your plate filled with low glycemic carbohydrates, which is going to be primarily vegetables, some fruits, maybe some of the low glycemic grains, but about 2/3 of your plate. So if you just think of your plate as just like a pie, and cover about 2/3 it with low glycemic vegetables, the other 1/3 should be a good quality protein food. And when there's a lot of research, eating like this not only helps overcome diabetes, it helps with weight loss, helps people feel better, helps balance their glandular system. And if you do this, you're also going to be getting a good proportion of acid-forming to alkaline-forming foods, so you're going to balance out your acid-alkaline reactions in the body as well. Now, this brings to mind some of my early experiences with working with diabetes. I read a book called Food is Your Best Medicine by Henry Beeler, And he talks about how he helped cure people of diabetes with diet. And what he did was he would put the diabetic patient on a diet of nothing but what he called non-starchy vegetables. Now, what that really means is he was putting them on a diet of nothing but low glycemic carbohydrates. He was using things like green beans and zucchini squash and chard and so forth, and he would allow them to eat only those vegetables until their blood sugar normalized. And then, once their blood, so he'd be giving them this vegetable diet, and after 2 or 3 days, their blood sugar level would come to normal. Then what he would do is he would introduce some protein back into their diet, some rare meat or meat that was slow cooked so that the proteins weren't denatured, and continue to monitor their blood sugar level. And then as they continued to stabilize, he introduced a little bit of fruit back into their diet and maybe a little bit of grain. And that's how he overcame diabetes. And this makes a lot of sense to me out of the modern research we're seeing, because if you eat nothing but low glycemic carbohydrates, you're going to greatly lower your insulin production. You're going to drop it way, way down. And in the meantime, you're going to be getting a lot of nutrients that overcome cellular resistance to insulin, because a lot of these vitamins and minerals that we have in the fruits and vegetables help with the problem of insulin resistance. So you're overcoming insulin resistance and stabilizing the blood sugar level, and then you gradually get the person back into a proper diet. Now, I had a very close friend who we worked with like that, got her to eat a lot of vegetables, started having her do some juicing, and we used just 2 herbs, licorice root and golden seal. When her blood sugar was low, we gave her licorice root. When her blood sugar was high, we gave her golden seal. And after a time, she was able to totally balance out her blood sugar and able to completely get off medication. When she went to the doctor and he checked her and said, "Gosh, you're not diabetic anymore," she told him what she'd been doing, and he says, "Now you can't say that cures diabetes. Sometimes things like this go in remission, so you can't go around claiming you cured yourself of diabetes because it's an incurable disease." Anyway, I thought that was kind of amusing, but it does show you that you can do this. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this as dramatically as Henry Beeler did. You can go a little more slowly if you eating the protein, eating mostly low glycemic carbohydrates. If you also make some other dietary changes at the same time, you won't get as dramatic a cure, but you'll be able to gradually work on this problem. One of the things that creates insulin resistance is the fats that we're eating. Research has shown that high-fat diets, where over 37% of the caloric intake is coming from fats, increases insulin resistance. So since a lot of Americans are eating way too much fat, that's one of the things that's contributing to the insulin resistance. Now, what makes it even worse is that trans fatty acids also increase insulin resistance. And trans fatty acids come from fats breaking down. Either it happens through an anaerobic bacterial thing taking place in the food. Well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. I've got a slide on that in a minute. But what we want to point out here is that monounsaturated fats have been shown to improve insulin sensitivity. So what we want to do is get rid of not go too high on the fat, get rid of the trans fatty acids, and go to monounsaturated fats in order to be able to overcome insulin resistance. Now let's talk a little bit about trans fatty acids. Trans fatty acids are formed either through anaerobic bacteria in animal products. In other words, you get some bacteria in the animal product and it starts to spoil a little bit, and it kind of breaks down the fats, and so you get some trans fatty acids. Or it happens through the hydrogenation of vegetable oils. What they do is, in order to make the oil more stable, and it also makes the oil make foods have a more crunchy texture, they bombard oil, they heat it up and bombard it with hydrogen, with a little bit of nickel, and that causes the hydrogen to saturate some of the bonds in the oil, and it makes the oil so it doesn't go rancid as easily, but it also creates these trans fatty acids. And trans fatty acids contribute to insulin resistance, and they also wreak havoc with some of our body's hormonal communications. and they're really not healthy for us at all. And so this includes all of the following. Shortening is a trans fatty acid, margarine is trans fatty acids, and hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oils contain trans fatty acids. So we really need to avoid these, and especially if a person's diabetic, they really need to avoid these. But you need to avoid them if there are immune disorders. I mean, this is also something that aggravates autoimmune conditions and so forth. What we want instead is monounsaturated fats. And so we want the bulk of the fats we're getting to be monounsaturated. Olive oil is one of the best sources of monounsaturated fat, and it is the oil that we should primarily use for eating and cooking. Avocados are another good source of monounsaturated fats, and there's a number of other nuts and seeds that have a lot of monounsaturated fats. Macadamia, hazelnuts, Brazil nuts, sesame seeds, almonds, pecans, etc. So basically we want to have our oils from nuts and seeds and avocados and olive oil. Now we also need to talk about essential fatty acids, because another thing with the fats that's creating this problem of insulin resistance is the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 essential fatty acids in our diet. Omega-6 is what's primarily in our vegetable oils, the corn oil, the soybean oil, all of these oils we're using. Omega-3 is found in flaxseed oil, hemp seed oil, walnut oil, and it's also found in wild game and deep ocean fish. I hate to break the news to you this, but I learned that the farm-raised salmon that we buy at the grocery store that actually has dye to make it look pink because it's so pathetically pale that it doesn't have the salmon color in and of itself, does not contain omega-3 essential fatty acids because it's being raised in a farming condition, and they don't put omega-3 in the feed. Therefore, if the omega-3 isn't in the animal's food, it doesn't get into the animal's body, and therefore it doesn't become a good source of essential fatty acids. So unless you're getting like wild salmon or sardines or stuff that's been coming out of the deep ocean, you're not going to get your omega-3s that way. Now the ideal ratio of omega-3, 6 to omega-3 is 1:1, although even a 2:1, that's 2 parts of omega-6 to 1 part omega-3, is pretty healthy. But in American diets, the typical ratio is 20:1 to 50:1. So you can see that we're way deficient in omega-3, and that's creating a lot of problems. What happens with that is that that with the trans fatty acids and the deficiency of omega-3, what happens with these essential fatty acids is they're converted into these little chemical messengers called eicosanoids that either calm down inflammation and dilate our arteries and lower our blood pressure and help our immune system, or they do the opposite. They constrict our arteries, promote inflammation, and suppress our immune system. Well, with low omega-3 and trans fatty acids and a high insulin triggering diet, we get a whole bunch of the eicosanoids that constrict our arteries, promote inflammation, and damage our immune system. And so that's one of the big things that's causing a lot of health problems with Americans. That's why this is such a critical part of all of this. Now, of course, exercise is another thing that can really help diabetes. That's because as we exercise and we use our muscles, it allows us to improves insulin sensitivity in the cells. So one of the benefits of exercise is it increases the insulin sensitivity or helps overcome insulin resistance. When our muscles begin to burn, you've been lifting weights or doing whatever, and you start to feel that little bit of a burn in your muscles, that's the point at which your muscles start taking up sugar without insulin. So the more you train your muscles, the less insulin is required for them to take up sugar, and the more insulin sensitive they are, and so the less insulin that gets produced. So you can see that exercise is really, really important for overcoming diabetes and hyperinsulinemia. There are some guidelines, though, we need to look at for people who have diabetes. First of all, because you may have some multiple health problems, you should talk to your healthcare practitioner for advice so that you don't get an exercise program that's inappropriate for your health conditions. And if you're going to go out walking or jogging or whatever, it's a good idea if you have diabetes to wear a little medical alert tag wrist or necklace they have, or identification cards. So if something happens to you, they know that you're a diabetic. Also, I've read that you're not supposed to exercise with diabetes if you also have high ketones, because diabetic ketoacidosis, that's the way you pronounce that word, can result. So be careful of that. And you should monitor your blood sugar before and after exercise, because since exercise causes you to take up more insulin and sugar, it can actually create hypoglycemia. So you have to kind of like start off gradually, and you're probably, if you're on insulin or medication, are going to wind up having to adjust the dose and reduce it over time in order to, as you exercise and the situation becomes better. So actually, as you start this program, as you start eating better, start exercising and taking the supplements, one of the things you want to do is check your blood sugar level frequently, and probably consult with your doctor frequently, because you're going to need to gradually make shifts with your medication. What typically happens with people who are doing this is their need for their diabetic medications begins to decrease. And if they work in conjunction with their doctor will wind up decreasing the requirements for their medication until they're completely off medication. Lots and lots of people have done this, so it's completely doable, but it does take some discipline. So what supplements do we need? What supplements can help us with this? Well, one of the first things we need is to supplement our diet with high-quality fats. What we need is that omega-3 EPA. So flaxseed oil has a good ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. That's a good way to get some essential fatty acids. You can also use the super GLA oil, but I really recommend for most people, and especially for diabetics, that they take the omega-3 EPA. Paul Bergner says he gives people the choice of either taking omega-3 EPA supplements or eating a can of sardines 2 or 3 times a week. And he says most people opt for the omega-3 EPA supplements because they don't like sardines. But one of the ways that some people don't like the omega-3 because it's a heavy oil and they kind of tend to burp it up. A little trick that I learned from Kim Ballas is that if you put the capsules in the freezer, then and take them frozen, you have less problem with burping the oil, and they are a lot easier to break down and digest. The second thing is that you got to get good quality protein in your body, and if you're a vegetarian or a vegan or whatever, that may be a bit of trouble, so you may need to add some protein and have a good protein supplement. The green zone and the pH green zone, the idea behind them is to have a food that was already zoned, meaning had the right balance of carbohydrates and protein in it. So those make good meal replacement beverages. You can also use super algae or center protein powder or free amino acids to get a little more protein into your body to help balance your blood sugar if you're on a vegetarian diet, because you do need the protein to stimulate glucagon production. Also, there's a lot of research that shows that fiber can help with diabetes. And the reason why this is important is because fiber is going to slow the rate at which the sugars are absorbed into the bloodstream from the food. So by having a little increase of dietary fiber, it slows the release of sugar into the blood, which means that you don't get these big spikes of insulin, and you get a better curve in your blood sugar. So products like Psyllium Whole's Combination, Fat Grabbers Loco, Nature's 3 Irritable Bowel Fiber, you don't have to take all of them, just pick one of them and take a couple of heaping teaspoons of fiber first thing in the morning before breakfast, and maybe again before going to bed. Another thing that can really help is working on the liver, because if the liver gets congested, it doesn't store sugar very well. And if it doesn't storing sugar very well, then the glucagon can't pull the sugar out to keep the blood sugar level stable, and you're likely to crave sweets. So a lot of the reasons why some people crave sweets or have problems is because of the liver. Years ago, I read Dorothy Hall, an Australian naturopath, in one of her books, says that she had cured many cases of diabetes just by working on the liver. So in a lot of cases, this diabetic problem stems from the liver, so it's important to take a look at liver function and possibly use some supplements to cleanse the liver. And here are some that we've got up on the screen: the Liver Cleanse Formula, Enviro Detox, Liver Balance, Blood Build, and Ho Shou Wu. And the combination of, by the way, the fiber and the liver herbs can also help to lower blood pressure and reduce cholesterol levels. So that's a very important benefit of those. In the time that's remaining, we're going to look at some of the herbs that actually help to directly overcome this problem of insulin resistance in the cells. So, and there are a lot of herbs that do this. One of the first ones that I learned was golden seal, and I mentioned my friend who used golden seal to help her with overcoming her diabetes. This was discovered by Nadine Griffin, who found out that golden seal worked as, well, she thought of it as a natural insulin, but what we now know is it helps overcome insulin resistance in cells. So what'll happen is you take golden seal, like if you're hypoglycemic and you take golden seal, it'll cause a lot of the sugar to leave your blood because it makes the cells more sensitive to insulin and it takes the sugar out of your blood. Another food that's really been good for diabetes is nopal. Nopal is actually cactus leaves. And I noticed when I was looking at the glycemic index that the cactus leaves or nopal are one of the lowest glycemic index foods that there is. So they don't trigger very much insulin production at all, and so they help to and they also help to reduce the insulin resistance in the cells. Native Americans who ate their traditional diet with nopal, like in the Southwest, never had diabetes, but when they were stuck on reservations and given rations of white flour and lard so that they learned to make Indian fry bread, now diabetes is rampant among Native Americans. So you can see that the traditional foods didn't cause that problem, but high fat, high simple carbohydrate diet did. Devil's Club, noni, gymnema, bitter melon, bilberry, fenugreek, the banaba leaf, jambul seed, blueberry leaf, bean pod, ginseng, both the American and the Korean ginseng, have all been shown to help overcome insulin resistance. There are also a couple of nutrients that can be very beneficial for overcoming insulin resistance, particularly some minerals. And these minerals are chromium, vanadium, and zinc. And these three minerals are very important in the pancreas in creating insulin as well. So the GTF chromium in particular is a form of chromium that's very beneficial for diabetics and helping to balance blood sugar levels. Let's look at some of the formulas that are available that can help with this. And I'm going to start off with one of my favorites. Actually, this is two different formulas. One is called Pro Pancreas, which used to be called P14, and the other one's called Target P14. Now, P14 is a combination that's been around for a long time. You can see the principal ingredient in it is golden seal, which helps to lower blood sugar levels. It's got juniper berries. There's a lot of kidney stuff involved with the insulin resistance. Uva ursi, even though it's a diuretic herb, also helps overcome insulin resistance a little bit. Cedar berries, another insulin herb. So what this is, 14 herbs for the pancreas that have been used to help overcome this type 2 diabetes. Now, I don't normally use the Pro Pancreas. What I use is the Target P14, because what Target P14 does is it takes those herbs and combines them with chromium and zinc, which we learned are two very important minerals, that are chelated to 3 amino acids that direct those minerals to the pancreas and to the tissues that help to regulate the blood sugar levels. And I have found Target P14 to be an absolutely great formula for helping type 2 diabetics. It just is very effective. It's the most effective to me of all of the formulas I've tried. Now, people are a little different, so it may not be as equally effective for everyone, and sometimes people need another formula more. But because this one combines these herbs along with the chromium and zinc, it can be very beneficial for the type 2 diabetics. I've had a lot of good success with helping people with this. PBS is another formula that we have that helps with this. PBS contains burdock, which is a liver herb, and cedar berries. And the story of cedar berries is very interesting because it goes back to Dr. John Christopher, who was an herbalist here in Utah, where I live, and one of the people who helped really start the modern herb movement. And he had a client that had some water retention problems, and he told him to go and eat some juniper berries. And the guy said he knew what they were, and he told him to eat 6 juniper berries a day, and that would solve his water retention problems. Well, the man came back about 6 weeks later, and he said he was still having problems with fluid retention, and that the juniper berries hadn't worked. And Dr. Christopher was very surprised, because juniper berries are a very good diuretic. So he had the man show him what he'd been eating. Well, he wasn't eating juniper berries. He was eating the berries of the thuja, or the arborvitae plant, which are also called cedar berries, not juniper berries. And the man says, well, you know what? I'm going to continue to take these cedar berries, even though they're not the right ones, because since I've been taking them, I don't have to take insulin anymore. And so that's how Dr. Christopher found out that these cedar berries, or these thuja berries, would help to overcome type 2 diabetes. And that's one of the main ingredients in this formula, along with golden seal. So this is also another formula that can really help with insulin resistance. There's a newer formula that has come out called Sugar Reg, which contains several herbs that have been shown to help overcome insulin resistance in the cells, along with chromium and vanadium. And vanadium has turned out to be one of the major minerals that's missing, that's causing insulin resistance. So this formula can be very helpful, although you might need to take quite a bit of it, because it takes quite a bit of the vanadium to make a difference. You might also try taking some colloidal minerals to get the vanadium, along with some of the other formulas we've talked about. We have 2 other major formulas that we need to discuss. One of them is the Ayurvedic blood sugar formula, which was originally called NBSAV. And this is a formula that has been used in Ayurvedic medicine for thousands of years to treat the problem that they call sweet urine, which is spilling sugar in the urine, which is what one of the ways that we discover a person is diabetic. I mentioned that actually India was the first country where diabetes was really identified as a disease, and it started when they began to settle down and cultivate grain. So they've been treating this particular problem for many, many years in India. One of the chief herbs in this is Gymnema, and Gymnema blocks sugar receptors. If you take Gymnema and you chew it in your mouth, sugar tastes like sand, and a chocolate bar tastes like mud. I mean, it totally removes the ability for you to be able to taste sugar if you chew it and put it on your tongue. Well, the theory is that it does the same thing in the intestines, that it actually blocks a little bit the sugar absorption sites in the small intestines, so that the sugar is absorbed more slowly into the bloodstream, which helps to bring down the insulin production. And it also contains the bitter melon, which is in the Sugar Reg as well, which is one of the herbs that overcomes insulin resistance. It contains turmeric, which is an herb for the liver, and fenugreek, which is another herb that's been shown to help with diabetes. So this is another formula that can be very beneficial for people with type 2 diabetes or hyperinsulinemia. One of the indications for this formula is if you have a lot of dryness, and your tissues don't seem to hydrate properly, that can be some of the beginning stages of insulin resistance. And NBSAV is helpful with that, along with this other formula, which is from Chinese medicine, called HYC. And this formula is for dryness. The person who needs this formula has dry skin and a dry mouth, and they drink lots of water, but the water just goes through them and they urinate it, and they still are dry. And that is one of the early symptoms of diabetes. It's actually a sign of hyperinsulinemia. You're getting too much sugar in the blood, too high of an insulin level, and you're getting a little bit of insulin resistance. So the water and the sugar are not going into the tissues, and the water is being used to flush the excess sugar out through the kidneys. So I've had very good results with this formula. When you see a person and they're getting that excessive thirst, they're drinking water, but they're not hydrating, and they're urinating a lot, I've put them on this formula, and usually within 2 to 3 days, it helps to balance this out. So this is an excellent formula for hyperinsulinemia. Now we're going to wrap this up by talking about the fact that with diabetes, you're always going to have circulatory problems. So it's very, very important to help the circulatory system. So some of the circulatory supplements are Megakel. MC is short for Megakel. Megakel is a formula that can be very beneficial for diabetics. Just taking it instead of a vitamin and mineral supplement, like 1 twice a day or 2 twice a day, can really improve the cardiovascular system for diabetics and help to prevent some of the complications that you get with diabetes. Garlic is very, very helpful for diabetics for the same reason. It enhances circulation and it helps to keep that peripheral circulation going better in diabetics. Ginkgo does the same thing. It also helps peripheral circulation. So your ginkgo hawthorn and your capsicum, garlic, and parsley, along with the Megakel, are all excellent products to prevent some of the circulatory side effects of diabetes. The other thing that you really have to be careful of with diabetes is the eyes. And so the bilberry, which is actually good for insulin resistance, can also be used to help protect the eyes in people who are diabetic. And Megakel will also help protect the eyes in people who are diabetic, so that it will keep the person from having, their eyesight from deteriorating, and keep their peripheral circulation going good so they don't develop the ulcerations in their extremities and so forth that are very common with diabetes. Well, the last thing that I want to talk about is that there are, just like there are with most illnesses, there are emotional issues that tend to go along with diabetes. The craving for sugar is really associated with the craving for sweetness in one's life. As I got into doing emotional healing, I learned this a long time ago. The first place that idea got planted in my head is I was listening to a lecture by a lady who was talking about how our mental attitude controls our physical body, and how the thoughts we think make changes in our body. And she mentioned that a case of a child who developed juvenile diabetes about 6 weeks after his mother died. And she made the statement, the sweetness went out of his life. And some years later, I was had a phone call from someone in Canada who had been working with someone who was diabetic. They'd been helping the person make some changes in their diet. They had the person on the pro-pancreas or P14 formula, and they had been making great improvements. The person had their blood sugar was stabilizing. They had reduced the amount of medication they were taking. They were showing lots of signs of improvement, and they'd made tremendous progress over 6 months towards resolving the condition. And she says, I don't know what to do. She says, because this week, in 1 week, she's worse than ever. I mean, everything that's happened is all undone, and her blood sugar is completely out of control. She's back on a whole bunch of medication and so forth. I said, what happened in this woman's life this last week? Well, she told me 2 things had happened. One is she'd gone to her doctor, and the doctor said that the insulin shots she was taking were deteriorating the retina in her eyes, and she was going to go blind eventually from the insulin. And the second thing is that her boyfriend had moved out on her and gone and moved in with someone else. And my mind went back to that lady's statement, the sweetness went out of her life. And since that time, I've observed that there is in this whole issue of craving sugar and this whole diabetic profile, there is this need for sweetness in our life. And a lot of us don't get the sweetness that we want in life. When I talk about sweetness, I'm talking about that warm, tender, fuzzy feeling, that joy that you get looking at a beautiful sunset, or smelling a rose, or squishing your toes in the mud, or just being with a close friend, that warm, tender, gentle, loving feelings. And so I think a lot of times we wind up using sugar to feed the need for sweetness in our lives. And I had a personal experience with this too, very close to my heart. I one time, I normally have not been a person who ate a lot of sugary foods. I would once in a while have a few cookies made with whole grains and honey and stuff, or a little bit of natural sweet, but I didn't crave it. And then one time I found myself just eating gobs of this sugary stuff. It was stuff from the health food store, but it was still sugary stuff. I was eating a whole box of cookies from the health food store in one sitting, one day. I was eating a half pound of yogurt or chocolate covered almonds from the health food store in one sitting. And after this had been going on for about a month, I thought, gosh, why am I doing this? Why am I craving all this sugar? And the thought was, well, the sweetness went out of your life. And I realized that I had started doing this the day that my children had moved back to Maine. My wife and I had been divorced, and she was taking the children, and they were going to be moving 2,000 miles away, and I wasn't going to be seeing them very often. And they had been a great source of joy in my life, and I had been craving sugar ever since. So I have observed a lot, when I start craving sugar, I stop and I think, well, what is it that's, caused the sweetness or some of the joy to go out of my life? And I start working on resolving some of those emotional issues, and the craving for sweets begins to diminish, and I'm able to find ways to get joy back into my life. There are some essential oils and some flower essences that we can use that will help to heal these pancreatic issues of having sweetness in our life. And some of the essential oils are listed here: anise, clove, coconut, honeysuckle, neroli, peppermint, and pink grapefruit. Some of these are very sweet fragrances that invoke feelings of nostalgia and sweetness and so forth. And so they can trigger some of that feeling of joy and so forth in a person's life. There are also some flower essences I've used a lot for helping people with these issues. One is California poppy, which is for people who are looking for finding that satisfaction in what the false gold, and finding it in fame or money or whatever, thinking that that's going to bring sweetness into their life, and it doesn't. The Canyon de Dalia, which is for an inflated psychic life, person who's living in their imagination and doesn't know how to enjoy their physical world. Honeysuckle, which is for nostalgia, living in the past, the good old days, all that's gone. Nasturtium for people who are overly dry and intellectual, which I see a lot in some type 2 diabetes, as they become overly intellectual and they lose their warmth and humor. But my favorite one, and the one that I've used the most with the most success for this particular problem, is zinnia, which is for lack of humor, being overly somber. It's for getting in touch with life's joys and being able to get in touch with the playful inner child, the part of us that can take delight in the simple things, enjoy the butterfly, enjoy the colors, enjoy the sweet and good things in life. So that is the approach to dealing with diabetes. It's a very holistic approach. There is hope. In other words, I really, really think it's frustrating that modern medicine says that diabetes is an incurable disease. If you're talking about swallowing a pill to cure it, yes, it's incurable. But if you're talking about making changes in your lifestyle, making changes in the way you eat, diet, and taking some supplements that overcome the insulin resistance and improve some of the ways the body functions, diabetes is a very curable disease and a very manageable disease. And the fact that it doesn't even exist in certain cultures shows that it is a disease of lifestyle alone, and that by making lifestyle changes, we can not only heal this problem in our society, but we can also learn to prevent it. Thank you for watching.